A chain snapped and rattled to the ground. Bolt cutters hit the dirt beside it. Then two hands, old and scarred, gripped the edge of a great iron door and pulled. The door didn't want to move. 40 years of rust fought back. The man leaned his whole weight into it, boots sliding in the gravel, teeth gritted against the pain in his bad leg. The door groaned. Then it gave, all at once, and swung open with a shriek across the empty airfield. Sunlight poured into the dark. Dust hung in the air. And there, in the middle of that huge empty hangar, sat something big under a canvas tarp gone gray with age. His name was Ray Kessler. He was 68 years old, and he'd just paid $13 for whatever was under that sheet. What Ray found under that tarp, he never saw coming. Stay with me. Let me back up. Because to understand what Ray found in that hangar, you have to understand the man who bought it, and why a broken old soldier would spend his last $13 on a pile of scrap nobody else wanted. Ray Kessler was 68 years old, and he lived alone in a single-wide trailer on the edge of a town that had mostly forgotten he existed. He'd been a soldier once. A long time ago. He'd gone off to a war when he was 19 years old, a farm kid who'd never been further than the next county, and he'd come home 2 years later a different man, with a piece of shrapnel in his leg that the doctors never got all the way out. It ached in the cold. It ached in the heat. Truth be told, it ached most of the time, but Ray had stopped mentioning it to anyone decades ago, because there was no one left to mention it to. He got by on a small disability pension. Not much. Enough for the trailer, enough for groceries if he was careful, enough for a cup of coffee at the diner on Sunday mornings, where he sat alone in the corner booth and nobody bothered him. He'd never married. There had been a girl once, before the war, but the war has a way of changing a man's timeline, and by the time Ray came home she'd married somebody else, and Ray had never quite found his way back to the idea of it. He'd made his peace with being alone. Or he told himself he had, which is not always the same thing. Now here's the thing about Ray that matters most for this story. Ray carried something. Every veteran of a certain kind carries it, and they don't talk about it, and you'd never know it to look at them. Ray had gone to that war with 11 other men. His unit. His brothers. And on one single day, on the far side of the world, in a green place that smelled like rain and diesel, all 11 of them had died. And Ray had not. Ray was the only one who came home. He'd spent 50 years asking himself why. Why him? Why the farm kid with the bad aim and the homesick heart, and not the others? Not Tommy, who had a baby girl he'd never met. Not Sergeant Doyle, who could make the whole platoon laugh with a single look. Not any of the 10 other men who were better and braver and more deserving of a long life than Ray Kessler ever felt he was. He came home. They didn't. And a man does not get over a thing like that. He just learns to carry it quietly, the way Ray carried the shrapnel in his leg. Let me tell you one small thing about Ray, so you understand the kind of man we're talking about. Every year, on the anniversary of the day he lost them, Ray Kessler would drive 4 hours each way to a national cemetery where 2 of his brothers were buried. He'd stand at those 2 graves, and then he'd walk the rows and find the graves of other men from his war, strangers, men whose families maybe couldn't make the trip that year. And he'd stand at each one for a minute and say the name out loud so that somebody had said it. He'd been doing it for 50 years. He never told a soul. He just believed deep down that the worst thing that can happen to a dead soldier is to be forgotten, and that as long as Ray was breathing, he could at least make sure a few of them weren't. So that was Ray. 68, alone, quiet, getting by. A man the world had used up and set aside. And on a cold Saturday morning in the fall, Ray Kessler drove his old truck out to the county auction. The way he sometimes did, not to buy anything, just to be around people for a few hours without having to talk to any of them. The auction was the usual. Foreclosed farm equipment. A repossessed boat. Boxes of somebody's whole life, sold off for pennies. Ray stood at the back with his coffee and watched, and he wasn't planning to raise his hand for anything. Then the auctioneer got to the last lot of the day. And nobody wanted it. It was an old airfield. Or what was left of one. A patch of county land out past the edge of town that had been a small airstrip back during the war, a training field, long since shut down and grown over. There was nothing left out there worth anything. Cracked runways full of weeds. A couple of collapsed outbuildings. And one big old hangar chained shut, rusting away, that hadn't been opened in 40 years. The county wanted it off the books. The bidding started at almost nothing, and it went nowhere, because who wants a ruined airfield and a rusted hangar full of God knows what? Probably full of rats. Probably not even safe to walk into. The auctioneer kept dropping the price, and the crowd kept staring at their shoes, and Ray Kessler stood in the back and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt curious. He couldn't have told you why. Maybe it was the word airfield. Maybe it was the idea of a place that had been built for the war, and then forgotten, just like him. Something about it reached out and took hold of him. It was the strangest thing. Ray had walked past 1,000 auction lots in his life, and never once felt the urge to raise his hand. Farm equipment, furniture, boats, none of it had ever spoken to him. But this ruined airfield, this thing nobody wanted, this monument to something that used to matter and didn't anymore, Ray looked at it and felt like he was looking in a mirror. And before Ray quite knew what he was doing, he raised his hand. The auctioneer looked almost relieved. $13. Going once. Going twice. And just like that, Ray Kessler owned an abandoned airfield and a rusted hangar, for the price of a tank of gas. The men around him chuckled. One of them clapped Ray on the shoulder and said, "What in the world are you going to do with that, old-timer?" And Ray didn't have an answer. He didn't know. He'd spent $13 he didn't really have on a pile of scrap, on a whim, and standing there in the parking lot afterward, he felt a little foolish about it. He almost went back inside to see if he could undo it. A man on a fixed pension doesn't throw away $13 on a joke, and that's what it felt like now, standing in the cold. A joke he'd played on himself. But he had the deed in his hand. And he was curious. And a curious man, even a tired old one, will drive out to see what he's bought. Now, if you've ever felt like the world used you up and set you aside, if you've ever done something on a strange, quiet impulse that you couldn't explain even to yourself, then you already understand why Ray drove out to that airfield the very next morning. And if you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what Ray found behind those hangar doors is the reason I wanted to tell you this whole story. The airfield was worse in person. Ray parked his truck at the end of a runway that was more weed than pavement and got out into the cold morning air. The wind came across that flat, empty land with nothing to stop it. The outbuildings were collapsed heaps. And the hangar stood at the far end, huge and silent, a great curved roof of rust and old timber, with 2 enormous doors held shut by a chain and a padlock that had seized solid decades ago. Ray stood there for a minute just looking at it. There was something about the place. It was dead quiet, the kind of quiet Ray knew well, the quiet of a place where important things had once happened and then stopped. He'd stood in places like that before, overseas, on ground where men had fought and died, and then the world had simply moved on and let the grass grow back. This felt like that. And Ray, who did not believe in much anymore, felt a strange certainty come over him, standing in front of that hangar, that he had not bought this place by accident. That something had brought him here. He shook it off, told himself he was a foolish old man letting his imagination run. But the feeling didn't leave. Ray had brought bolt cutters. It took him 3 tries and everything his old arms had left, but the chain finally snapped and rattled to the ground. And then Ray gripped the edge of that great iron door, and he pulled, and 40 years of rust fought him every inch of the way, until the door gave all at once and swung open with a shriek across the empty field. Sunlight poured into the dark. Dust hung in the air. And there, in the middle of that huge empty space, sat something big under a canvas tarp gone gray with age. Ray stood in the doorway a long moment, his heart beating harder than it had in years. Then he limped inside, across a concrete floor thick with dust, up to the shape under the tarp. It was big, bigger than a car. And the way the canvas draped over it, he could see the suggestion of wings. His hands were shaking as he took hold of the tarp. And he pulled. The canvas slid off and pooled on the floor in a cloud of dust. And Ray Kessler took 1 step back, and put a hand over his mouth, and forgot how to breathe. It was an airplane. An old one. A single-engine fighter plane from the war. His war. Sitting there in the dark on flat tires, gray with dust but whole, completely whole, its propeller still intact, its cockpit glass unbroken. A genuine wartime aircraft, hidden away in a chained hangar and forgotten for 40 years, and now it belonged to a man who had paid $13 for it. Ray walked around it slowly, running one hand along the cold metal of the wing, leaving a clean streak in the dust. He knew this plane. Not this exact one, but the type of it. He'd watched planes just like it take off from a field like this one when he was young, before he ever shipped out. The sight of it dragged 50 years up out of the ground all at once. And that was when he saw the markings. Faded, but there. Painted on the side of the fuselage, under the cockpit, was a name. And a small row of symbols. And Ray Kessler stopped dead, because he knew that name. The name painted on the side of that airplane was Doyle. Now, I need you to understand what that meant. Because this is where a story about a lucky old man finding a valuable antique turns into something else entirely. Doyle. Sergeant Doyle. The man who could make the whole platoon laugh with a single look. One of the 11 men who had died on the far side of the world on the day that Ray Kessler alone survived. Ray stood in that hangar, one hand on a 50-year-old airplane, and the whole world seemed to tilt underneath him. Because this was not a coincidence. This could not possibly be a coincidence. What were the odds that a broken old survivor would raise his hand at an auction, on a whim, and by the one hangar in the county that held an airplane bearing the name of one of his dead brothers? Ray's legs went out from under him. He sat down hard on the dusty floor beside that airplane, And for the first time in more years than he could count, Ray Kessler wept. Not from sadness, exactly. From something bigger than sadness, something he didn't have a word for. It felt like being found. It felt like a hand reaching out of the past and taking hold of his. When he could stand again, Ray searched that hangar from end to end, and what he found filled in the rest of the story, piece by piece. There were footlockers along one wall, stenciled with names Ray recognized, names of his dead. There were crates of records. And in a small office at the back of the hangar, in a rusted filing cabinet, Ray found the papers that explained everything. The airfield, it turned out, had not just been a training field. After the war, it had been something else. A quiet, half-official project run by a wealthy man, a man named Halloran, whose own son had died in Ray's unit. That was the piece Ray hadn't known. There had been a 12th connection to his platoon he'd never been aware of. Halloran, grieving, wealthy, and with nowhere to put his grief, had spent a fortune after the war doing one strange and beautiful thing. He had tracked down and bought the personal effects, the vehicles, and in one case, this airplane connected to the men of that unit. He had gathered them here, in this hangar, meaning to build a memorial. A museum. A place where the 11 men who died would not be forgotten. And then Halloran had died too, before he could finish it. Suddenly, of a stroke, with no other family, and no instructions anyone could find. And so the hangar had been chained shut, and the airfield had reverted to the county for unpaid taxes, and the whole thing, the airplane, the footlockers, the memorial that was never built, had sat in the dark for 40 years waiting. Waiting, it seemed to Ray, for the one man left alive who would understand what it was. Ray sat with those papers for a long time. He read Halloran's letters, the ones the man had written and never sent, the same way Ray had spent 50 years talking to men who couldn't hear him. And Ray understood Halloran completely, better than he'd ever understood anyone. Here was a father who had lost his only son, and could not bear for the world to move on as if those young men had never existed. Here was a man who had money but no way to buy back the one thing he wanted, and so he'd done the only thing grief allows. He'd tried to build something that would remember. And he'd run out of time, the way we all do, the way Doyle and Tommy and the others had run out of time on the far side of the world. Ray Kessler, the only survivor, had bought his brother's memorial for $13, without ever knowing it existed. 50 years the world had spent forgetting those men. And it had all been waiting, chained in the dark, for the one person on Earth who never would. Now, here is where you find out what kind of man Ray was. Because a lesser man, sitting on a genuine wartime fighter plane worth an enormous amount of money, freshly discovered that he owned it free and clear, would have thought first about the money. And believe me, there was money in it. Ray had that plane appraised quietly, by a man who came out from the city and walked around it for 2 hours with his mouth hanging open. Aircraft like this one, the man told Ray, restored with documented history, almost never come on the market. Collectors and museums would line up for it. The number he named was more money than Ray Kessler had seen in his entire life. More money than 50 years of disability checks put together. Enough to leave the trailer. Enough to live out his days in real comfort for the first time ever. The appraiser gave Ray his card and told him to call any time, that he could have 3 serious buyers on the phone by the end of the week. Ray put the card in his shirt pocket. And he never called it. He thought about it. He'd be lying if he said he didn't. But he thought about it sitting on the floor of that hangar, looking up at the name Doyle painted on the fuselage, and he knew, the way you know a true thing all at once, that he could no more sell that airplane than he could sell one of the men themselves. And here's the thing that made it a real decision, not an easy one. Ray was poor. Truly poor, in the way that grinds a person down day after day. That money would have meant a warm house instead of a trailer that froze in winter. It would have meant a doctor for the leg that had hurt every day for 50 years. It would have meant not counting change at the grocery store. For a man who had given his whole youth and his whole body to his country and gotten a small check and a lifetime of pain in return, that airplane was a way out. Nobody on Earth would have blamed Ray Kessler for selling it. Not one soul. But Ray blamed himself just for thinking about it. Because selling that plane meant scattering it. Meant some rich collector flying it at air shows with Doyle's name painted over. Meant the footlockers going to an estate sale, the letters going in the trash, the 11 men disappearing all over again, this time for good. And this time because Ray, the last one left, had let it happen for money. And Ray Kessler had spent 50 years driving to cemeteries to say strangers' names out loud, so they wouldn't be forgotten. He was not about to forget his own brothers for a comfortable chair and a warm room. So Ray Kessler did not sell it. Instead, Ray did the thing that Halloran had died before he could do. He finished the memorial. It took him the rest of his life, and it was the best thing he ever did. Ray used what little money he had. And then he did something that did not come easy to a proud man who'd never asked anyone for anything. He asked for help. He went to the local veterans post and he told them the story, and the story spread the way true stories do. Younger veterans came out to the airfield on weekends. They cleared the runways. They shored up the hangar roof. A retired aircraft mechanic, a Vietnam man, spent 2 years lovingly restoring that fighter plane until it gleamed. Local businesses donated materials. The town that had forgotten Ray Kessler remembered him now, because Ray had given them something to be proud of. And something happened to Ray in those months that was almost as important as the memorial itself. For the first time in 50 years, Ray Kessler was not alone. Every Saturday morning there were trucks in the lot and men on ladders and coffee going around, and in the middle of it all was Ray, telling stories, pointing out where things should go, being needed. Young veterans who'd come home from their own wars carrying their own silence found their way out to that airfield, drawn by something they couldn't name, and they'd end up sitting with Ray on the tailgate of his truck at the end of the day, and Ray would talk to them, quietly, in a way that only a man who has carried what they carry can. He was healing something in himself by building that place. And he was healing something in a whole lot of other men too, without ever calling it that. And piece by piece, that rusted hangar on a forgotten airfield became exactly what a grieving father had dreamed of 40 years before. A memorial. A small museum. 12 names on a wall of polished stone. 11 for the men who died, and 1 for Halloran, the father who tried to honor them. The footlockers were opened, and the letters and photographs inside were framed, so that Tommy's baby girl, now a grandmother herself, could finally see her father's handwriting. So that families who had spent 50 years with nothing but a folded flag could come and stand in a place built to remember. On the day the memorial opened, they held a ceremony on the old airfield. There were hundreds of people. There was a color guard and a bugler, and the restored fighter plane sat in the sunlight with the name Doyle shining on its side. And Ray Kessler, the only survivor, the man the world had used up and set aside, stood in front of all those people and told them about 11 men who deserved to be remembered. He named every one. He told a story about each of them. He made the crowd laugh, telling them about Doyle, and he made the crowd cry, telling them about Tommy's letters home. And then something happened that Ray had not planned for. An old woman came forward out of the crowd, leaning on a cane, helped along by a younger woman at her elbow. Ray didn't know her, but she introduced herself, and the whole field went quiet because her last name was Doyle. She was the sergeant's little sister. She'd been a girl of 10 when her brother didn't come home, and she was in her 70s now, and she had read about the memorial in the paper and driven 300 miles to be there. She took Ray's hand in both of hers, and she looked up at the airplane with her brother's name on it, restored and gleaming in the sun, and she could not speak. She just held on to Ray Kessler's hand and cried, and Ray held on right back, one more link in a chain that reached all the way to a green place across the world 50 years before. And when he was done, an old man who had spent 50 years asking why he alone had survived finally had his answer. He had survived to do this. To be the one who came home and remembered. To make sure that 11 good men and 1 grieving father were not forgotten. That was the mission. That was why. Ray Kessler had spent his whole life waiting to understand, and he'd found the answer under a canvas tarp in a hangar he bought for $13. Ray lived another 11 years, and he spent them as the keeper of that memorial. He was there every single day it was open. He gave the tours himself, for as long as his leg would let him, and then from a chair by the door when it wouldn't. School groups came. Veterans came, some of them carrying their own quiet burdens, and Ray had a way of talking to those men, one survivor to another, that no counselor ever could. He never charged a dime. He put a donation box by the door and used every cent of it to keep the place running. There was one young man Ray never forgot. A kid really 26 years old, back from a war of his own and not doing well. He'd lost friends over there, and he'd come home to a country that seemed to have moved on without him. And one gray afternoon he drove out to the airfield because he'd heard there was an old man there who understood. He and Ray sat by the door of that hangar for 3 hours. Ray didn't give him advice. He didn't tell him it would be okay. He just told him about Doyle and Tommy and the others, and about 50 years of driving to cemeteries to say strangers' names, and about how a man carries the ones he loses, not by putting them down, but by finding something to do with the weight. The kid came back the next weekend. And the one after that. He started helping Ray run the place. And years later, that same young man would be the one who took over the memorial when Ray was gone. Ray had done for him exactly what the hangar had done for Ray. He'd given him a reason. He never did leave the trailer. He didn't want to. He said the memorial was the only home that mattered, and he was there more than he was anywhere else anyway. He never sold the airplane, though the offers kept coming, some of them staggering. He turned down every one. That plane, he'd say, isn't for sale. It's already where it belongs. And every morning, before he opened the doors to the public, Ray Kessler would stand alone in that quiet hangar in front of the wall of 12 names, and he would talk to them. He'd tell them the news. He'd tell them who came to visit. He'd tell them he was taking care of things, that they weren't forgotten, that he was still here, still holding the line, the last man standing watch. Some mornings he'd tell them about his leg, and laugh, and say he'd be seeing them soon enough, and they could compare wounds. Some mornings he didn't say anything at all. He'd just stand there in the cool quiet with his brothers, and let the peace of the place settle over him. And then he'd open the doors and let the light pour in, the way it had that first cold morning, when a curious old man pulled a chain off a rusted hanger and found his whole life's purpose waiting in the dark. The day Ray Kessler died, he died in the chair by the door of the memorial he built, in the afternoon sun, with the fighter plane gleaming in front of him and the wall of names on the wall behind. There'd been a school group through that morning, and Ray had told them all about Doyle, and one little boy had saluted the airplane on his way out, the way children do, and Ray had saluted him right back. That was the last tour he ever gave. In the afternoon, when the young man who helped him came to check on him, he found Ray in his chair, his eyes closed, the sun on his face. They found him with a small smile, like a man who had finally been given leave to rest. Like a man who'd finished the job and could stand down at last. They added a 13th name to the wall of stone. Ray Kessler. The one who came home. The one who remembered. They buried him out at the airfield, at his own request, within sight of the hangar, so that even in the ground he could keep watch over the place and the men inside it. The young man he'd taken under his wing kept the memorial open, and keeps it open to this day, and tells Ray's story to everyone who comes, so that the last man of that unit is remembered as faithfully as he remembered the other 11. The morning he pulled that chain off the door, Ray Kessler believed he was a used-up old man who'd wasted his last $13 on a pile of rust. He was wrong. He'd just paid $13 for the reason he was still alive. He'd spent 50 years asking why he was the one who came home. And the answer, it turned out, had been sitting in the dark under a canvas tarp, waiting all that time for Ray to come and find it. He came home so that 11 good men would not be forgotten. And in the end, that turned out to be the finest bargain any man ever made.